VCU owns a group of historic buildings that it bought long ago as cheap real estate. These buildings have turned out to be a nationally important open-air museum. And today's presenters, the Brownells, have helped us to understand why these buildings matter. And they've helped VCU Libraries build its holdings of rare documents to interpret these buildings. In 2015, Charles Brownell officially retired after 30 years of teaching in Virginia at the University of Mary Washington, UVA, and VCU. But even in retirement, he and his sister Louise continue to teach at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Charles earned a master's degree at the Winterthur Museum and a doctorate at Columbia University. Many of his publications have won awards, but to name one in particular, Charles is co-author of the Virginia Museum book, The Making of Virginia Architecture, which is the only general history of its subject. He's even prouder, though, of having shaped a series of brilliant students at VCU, and his students' dissertations, theses, and other papers are mostly available here at VCU Libraries. In retirement, Charles collaborates on presentations with Louise, who served as the Maryland Historical Society Registrar during the period when Charles was teaching at VCU. Louise did her undergraduate and graduate work at the universities of Texas, Michigan, and Delaware. Last year, she and Charles created a fund in VCU Libraries Special Collections and Archives in memory of their mother, Bess T. Brownell. Let us know if you'd like more information about how you too can contribute to this. We've made a kind of tradition in the past few years of hosting the Brownells every April to further explore VCU's historic architecture. Today's event was originally scheduled for last spring, but it was postponed like almost everything else because of the pandemic. And we're really happy to be getting back to our scheduled program.
Louise and I like to ask, what's it for? And how's it put together? What's this event for? What's it for and how's it put together? Both of them, but first, what's it for? This event is to invite you to enjoy some historic houses at VCU by looking. Our theme is making mansions. If you know how a thing was made, you see into it and you can enjoy it more. So this year we're doing making mansions. Next year we'll do adorning mansions, not that there's a clear separation between making and adorning. What this event is for is also to convey 4 theses. And the first thesis, VCU's Monroe Park campus as a whole is a unique, nationally important outdoor museum of architectural history. We won't look at the whole campus, we'll stick with Franklin Street today. Second thesis, one of the merits of this group is as a gallery of masonry, brick, stone, mortar, and plaster. In a graduate seminar, we'd look at the 4 kinds of masonry, brick, stone, mortar, and plaster, but mortar and plaster are quite technical. We'll focus on what you can learn about by looking, and that's brick and stone. We base today, above all, on a classic study, Harley McKee's Introduction to Early American Masonry. McKee was an eminent preservationist, writing about a subject on which he had decades of authority. He published his book in 1973. When I'd been out of graduate school for a few years, I became ashamed of how little I knew about building techniques. I carried McKee around Baltimore, and this short, simple book taught me a marvelous amount. It's so good that when it went out of print, I had it photocopied regularly for my VCU grad students. This is my battered old copy, which Louise beat up some more when she went to grad school. The book was reprinted in 2017 with the identical contents. The source list in your handout tells you about this. If you spend an hour with the chapter on brick or stone, looking at a wall becomes like watching a good play. If you buy a cheap used copy via an online service such as Add-All or Bookfinder, you don't need to worry about banging the book up on the street. So then, this course is also an invitation to read along the lines of our third and fourth theses, and the third thesis. Brick is the wonder material for its practicality and range. And the fourth thesis, stone is the monumental material. It is also the eloquent material that lets us glimpse the past back for hundreds of millions of years. If you take away, there we go, how often I miss my cues. If you take away our thesis ideas and some delight in what we show you, the lecture will do its job. That's what today is for. How's today put together? There's a preface, a body with an introduction, and our two media, a closing, a 7-minute break, time for questions, and in place of the tour that we usually do, a set of tips so you can go touring on your own. We framed the presentation between VCU's earliest historic mansion on West Franklin and the latest. The earliest mansion is the Ritter Hickok House, built in 1855 for William Ritter, a successful cabinet maker. Originally, it looked like this. It's the one house on this campus where enslaved or freed African-American craftsmen are likely to have worked before the Civil War. We owe our understanding of the extensive role of antebellum Black masonry workers and woodworkers to a landmark study published 30 years ago by Greg Kimbrell, now at the Library of Virginia. And we thank Ryan Smith of VCU's Department of History and Ray Bonus of Cabell Library for telling us that to date, they know of no research on the craftsman who built Ritter's house. Later owners enlarged the house several times. The crucial patrons are Mr. and Mrs. R. Lancaster Williams. Just after 1900, they had the Richmond firm of Nolan and Baskerville rework the house into the form that we know. Across the street is the latest mansion. It's Hudson House, built in the 19-teens by Nolan and Baskerville for Mr. and Mrs. Eppa Hunton Jr. Hunton was one of the founders of the well-known legal firm of Hunton and Williams. Just as the Ritter Hickok House helps us learn about brick, the Hutton House tells us about stone. And where are we in our event? We're in the preface. And now that means you, Louise and me, and it. You, we trust you got the handout. You just follow down the page. The handout takes you through each step of the lecture. It lists the main ideas or theses and the main buildings we'll see. In the middle are major illustrations. In back, there's sources. Every source we mention, and then some. That's you. Now, us. I've worked for years on Virginia architecture, and as Greg mentioned, I'm co-author of the award-winning standard book on the screen. While I was on the VCU faculty, Louise served as registrar at the Maryland Historical Society. She and I now teach one course a year at the Virginia Museum in connection with those collections, above all, the stellar Lewis collection of decorative arts. Louise is in my class this fall, deals with our specialty, the avant-garde in design between 1870 and 1940, such as this magnificent piece in the museum. It was designed by Walter Crane, the leader of the arts and crafts movement. Today, we're again bringing design history to this room. That's you and Louise and me. Now, it, our subject. In 1992, when I moved to VCU, I found that it had in the past bought whole streets of historic buildings. Some buildings appear in this standard guide. Move in on the VCU buildings. There are some of the VCU buildings in the book, but they appear just as thumbnails without names or dates. Professor Bowie Harwood's students in interior design had begun studying these buildings, but there was much for my students, Louise and me, to explore. As your source list says, most student papers are in special collections here at Cabell. By degrees, VCU is putting them online. The most germane is this classic by Carrie Culhane, who earned a master's here, became a major preservationist in Manhattan, and hopes to finish a doctorate at University College London in 2022. Very nice. Now, to finish off the preface, a thank you. The Cabell staff has collaborated to make today possible. Off screen, Yuki Hibben and Ray Bonus of Special Collections, then Antonia Basser, Kelly Gottschalk, and the infinitely painstaking Greg Kimbrell. We love working with them. That's the preface. Onto the body. The introduction that means where and when are we talking about? Where? Prosperous Richmonders at first lived downtown. By degrees, fashion moved west, out Franklin Street. We owe our understanding of how this happened, above all, to our late colleague, Tyler Potterfield, whose history of Richmond you can read. That's where, and we slid into when, the late 1800s. We're looking within the modern era, the age from the 1750s on. The Monroe Park area reminds us of a fact. The modern era offers us a wild range of artistic sources, of artistic inspiration. In the modern age, inspiration has become available from all history and all the globe. A glance at the picture on today's invitation suggests as much. We see three quite stylistically different houses, But none of these buildings are much like their historic sources. These buildings belong to the modern world. Such a range of sources is still available to anyone who wants to use them. Enough intro. Now to houses. We've taken a tip from lectures by Ray Bonus, who is incidentally Senior Research Associate at Cabell. Like Ray, to lighten the mood. In the past, as we've moved from topic to topic, the signal has been the picture of cute mascots. Today, though, our mascot is Cosmo, the crinoid, a fossil. Cosmo was more attractive in his youth, several hundred million years ago. He's also known as a sea lily. And Cosmo says, enough intro. Time for brick and stone. So, to brick and that thesis. Brick is the wonder material for practicality and range. And first, general matters. Excuse me. Richmond is historically a city of brick. What are bricks? For Virginia brick, we have two standard sources by distinguished architectural historians. Calder-Loth's study and Carl Lounsbury's book. But we can't beat the definition in the Oxford English Dictionary, or OED, the great authority on the English language, which defines brick as a building material consisting of molded blocks, typically made from clay, which are dried or baked to a hard stone-like consistency. That's the basics. A material made from clay, a substance found so widely around the world that brick approaches being a universal medium. And then brick is pressed, as the dictionary says. The OED also names the two main kinds of brick, dried and baked or fired. Brick dried in the sun has been used by uncountable hordes since prehistory, but our concern is baked or fired brick. Now, a little technical detail about the familiar American versions. The long face of a brick is called the stretcher. The short face is the header. Bricks are modular. That means that the faces are proportioned to each other so that bricks will fit together in many patterns. These patterns are called bonds. Harley McKee shows how they work. You see how the bricks laid with the stretchers showing create much, if not all, of the front and back of a wall. Bricks laid with the headers showing bind the front and back of a wall together. The outside pattern of a brick wall lets us know what its innards are. Fired bricks are fireproof. Good bricks are phenomenally durable. They can be used in most traditional structural systems, from walls to arches. They're practical to work with because one person can lift one brick in one hand and slide it into place. Bricks are the only building material that has been successfully prefabricated for 4,000 years, and no one can count their range of effects. Now, examples. Before the coming of railroads, builders used materials prepared on site or nearby. And Richmond brickmakers weren't too good at their work. We see that at the Ritter-Hickok House. Here we go. Missed another cue, eh? Well, it happens. And we know about the Ritter-Hickok House thanks to a superlative paper by Meredith Hurtle. The Ritter-Hickok bricks are mostly the originals from 1855. When you look next to the front door, you see how irregular those bricks are. For better bricks, we can go to two houses next door. Here's the Saunders Willard house, now Founders Hall, finished in 1885. The walls are machine pressed bricks, which came in the 1870s. These were probably made in Baltimore. And the surface tells you these bricks are hard. They defy the ages, very regular. Like the rest of the house, they embody the very modern, high Victorian love of machine finishes. You see the brick has a fine affinity for stone, and the panel under the window shows some of the flexibility of brick for decoration. The border is specially molded. The filling is laid with vertical bricks called a soldier course. Right next door is Ginter House, finished in 1891 to the designs of Page and Kent of Washington, D.C. Here, everything embodies a late Victorian taste, not for machine finishes, but for craft finishes. This was an early phase of the arts and crafts movement. The walls are a serenade to brick, which is here some kind of specialty brick, beautifully matched in color to the stonework. Every surface is meant to break up the light, and we see the marvelous decorative capacity of brick. The walls are an ordinary bond up to the third story. At the third story, the wall shifts to a soldier course, then to a basket weave bond, not structurally strong, but okay in an upper floor. This treatment is meant to break up the light in a way we've never captured in photos. We can get a little closer and try again. Along the edge of the roof, you notice bricks laid diagonally in mouse tooth bond, which is rare, if not unique in Richmond, and which also diversifies the surface. At the round window, we see that brick can be cut and carved, also rare, if not unique in Richmond. And the Ginter House details include even finer examples of cut and carved brick. To the right, the chimney shows us specialty molded brick. And writing overall, we see brick's affinity for terracotta tiles, a different kind of baked clay. We do tend to think of brick as red. Here's the Ishtar gate of ancient Babylon. And a panel from the gate in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a reminder that we owe the fired brick to the ancient Near East, and we see a jewel-like spectrum of colors. The point is made quite effectively by this recent exhibition catalog on the Ishtar gate. Unthinkably, I left the citation out of the source list. If you're interested, you'll find a wonder to behold easily on the Princeton University Press website. But we can create our own spectrum if we add a bit of Metro Richmond to the Monroe Park campus. We can get red, red-orange, yellow-orange, yellow, and you begin to glimpse how a range of textures and bonding patterns diversifies brick. We can get rose yellow. If we enamel the front, we can have almost any color, such as rosy green blue. There's a purple and what are usually called black glazed bricks. And there's all sorts of browns and buffs and grays. And we'll bet that you can find still more colors. We can have brick in the colors of the rainbow, depending on the minerals put into the clay or into a glaze on top. We've shown you the bricks fast without naming their sources, because if this interests you, you need to search out your own Ishtar rainbow. Learning to enjoy color rather than just reacting to it is one of life's great calorie-free, fat-free, salt-free pleasures. To repeat that thesis, fired brick is a wonder, made of widely available material, ideal for all kinds of structural systems, fireproof and otherwise durable, with affinities to other durable materials, prefabricated for 4,000 years, capable of being pressed, especially molded, cut, carved, and laid in more different bonds than we can count. Handy. One person can lift one brick in one hand and set it, and brick is open to a dazzling range of beautiful treatments. Of course, you can paint bricks, but that turns a low maintenance material into a higher maintenance material. But Cosmo says, time for stone. So to stone and the thesis. Stone is the monumental material. It is also the eloquent one that lets us glimpse the past for hundreds of millions of years. Start with general matters. There are three kinds of building stone. Three. Igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. In effect, all three kinds competed on West Franklin Street. The subject of building stone is profoundly intricate. For those of us who aren't geologists, it's enough to sketch the story. We see all three kinds of stone, igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic, at VCU's youngest historic mansion, Hudson House. First, igneous stone. We walk up the front steps and look down to see this stone. It was formed by the crystallization of molten rock or magma hundreds of millions of years ago. Igneous rock is the hardest stone used in building. The familiar form is granite, which we see here. Granite has long been used for places that get hard use, for instance, steps, door sills, and curbs. The word granite means having grains. And you see different colored grains, beautiful grays, pale ochre, flecks of jet black, and tiny sparkles. You can't gauge the effects from photos. As usual, you have to look in the flesh, and then you can appreciate that the surface is semi-translucent, and there's a whole constellation of sparkles. The stone here is probably the lovely local granite that was the object of a national industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We looked at this subject in our last Artistic Mansions lecture, so we'll take granite as largely covered. Rocks disintegrate into sediment, which sometimes nature re-cements into sedimentary rock. Such stone is also called freestone because a chisel moves freely across the surface. The two major kinds of sedimentary rock used in building are sandstone, where the sediment is sand, and limestone, where the sediment is calcium and magnesium carbonates made by underwater life. Limestone. And most of the front of Hudson House is limestone, such as the columns. The third kind of rock is metamorphic. Over the ages, unthinkable pressure or heat or both can metamorphose one kind of rock into another. For instance, limestone can turn into marble. We can climb the steps again and see marble in the paving. Marble is prized for its decorative effect. Inside a granite border, the Hutton porch is decorated with two different colors of marble, a gray and ivory inner border and a gray and rose pavement. Marble often has a faint translucency, sometimes suggestive of a porcelain plate. For this lecture, we'll see a little marble, but we'll focus on sedimentary rock, sandstone and limestone. And I meant to say, you see that marble is a relatively soft stone, all too easily damaged, but decorative withal. Now, examples. Sandstone. Yes, it's time for sandstone, which came from quarries in various states by rail and competed for popularity in West Franklin. Sandstone hit its peak in the second half of the 19th century. Most of all, that means so-called brownstone, which technically belongs to a family of red sandstones. In the 19th century, Americans enjoyed the family of brown colors: chocolate, caramel, cinnamon. We limit ourselves to the best documented brownstone, a stone from Pennsylvania. This stone came from a town east of Harrisburg called Hummelstown, near the candy manufacturing city of Hershey. Hummelstown stone was quarried exclusively by the Hummelstown Brownstone Company. It had a national vogue in the late 19th century and early 20th. The authority is Ben Olina, as an avocation springing from a 1965 master's thesis on Hummelstown stone. Mr. Olina spent decades on the subject and produced a fastidious book. Here we're especially indebted to Ray Bonus for keeping us up to date on Mr. Olina's researches. Mr. Olina's book tells us about the 5 kinds of Hummelstown brownstone, ranging from hard purplish stone used for areas that got heavy wear, to the softer chocolate-colored stone, the most popular. We learn about the workforce, which as of 1887 included 125 African Americans from Virginia, a story that we'd like to know more about than the little that the documents say. One wonders, had some of these men come from the Richmond granite quarries? And we learned that Hummelstown handled all the finishing processes, including carving, unlike other quarries, which left the stone to be finished on the building site. Not only do we have this book, but around 1910, the firm published its own small book. The work tells us about the firm, shows us the operations, and gives a list of where its stone was used nationwide. There's the Richmond listing. That list includes almost all the Franklin Street buildings you see on the screen. The row of houses on your right, the mansion on the far side of Harrison Street on your left, but not the mansion in the middle. These are all in the freestyle created by the great Boston architect H.H. Richardson. Let's move in on the row houses. They were probably designed and certainly built by the Richmond builder Gilbert Hunt, who erected them as a none too refined speculation. We've learned much about Hunt from my students' papers, above all one by Victoria Maloney. And thanks to a superb paper by Jolene Milot, we know that the mason in charge of the stonework was the aptly named William R. Mason, a big figure in local building. We'll sweep in on 924 West Franklin. Lo and behold, the front steps are that hard purple Hummelstown brownstone. The rest of the stone is cocoa colored and softer and comes from a different Hummelstown quarry. You get roughly the point from the picture, and you have that picture in the handout, but to say it again, you don't really get the effects of materials from photos. In the flesh, not only is the color difference apparent, but it's clear that the purple stone is denser than the rest. I worked next door for 22 years without realizing that there was a color difference. It took Alina's book to show me what was under my nose. The odd pillars are made by stacking blocks of stone, which is cheaper than using a single block or monolith. The design is probably a trademark of Gilbert Hunt or William and Mason. So too are the capitals, no two alike. The idea of having no two the same belongs to a brief fad triggered by a half-baked, self-appointed British critic named John Ruskin. Ruskin announced that just as nature makes no two trees or clouds the same, architects should never repeat capitals. This makes as much sense as saying that we should never cook the same meal twice. Nonetheless, the results are handsome in other cases. The capitals on Hunt or Mason buildings are clumsy. One suspects they were not only designed, but also carved in Richmond, not Hummelstown. Now, we go to the next corner for the William Anderson House, designed by a major Richmond architect named Charles Reed. Several students have contributed to our understanding here. Conspicuously, Carly Porter, now Dr. Porter, assistant chair of art history. On this house, the lavish carving is coherent in design and crisp in execution. It was surely cut in Hummelstown. Mr. Olina stressed the point in an email to Ray. Ray himself has contributed this indispensable article, which you can get online. The Anderson imagery belongs to the freestyle of the period, which favored random motifs. Other Richmond mansions had such detailing. One of these stood on the 800 block of West Franklin, but was demolished in the 50s. This is Charles Reed's Brown House, which is in your handout. There's the fanciful carving. We know this house best from Ray Bonus's article. This Richardsonian style was, alas, a little too monumental, and it was dying by the 1890s when this house went up. Brownstone enjoyed a vast popularity in the 19th century, but from the turn of the century, there came a shift in American color preferences. That color shift was, in effect, from chocolate to vanilla, and the preference has remained potent in American taste ever since. And now it's Cosmo's big scene. Time for limestone. In sedimentary stone, the shift meant the rise of a pale limestone, above all the fine stone from Indiana, which is where Cosmo came from. The center of limestone quarrying is south of Indianapolis, the town of Bedford, also known as the Stone City. The stone here, or from here, is properly called Bedford limestone, but technically it's called Salem limestone. Ron Bell is one of the authors who has given us a detailed account of this stone. Our case in point is the front of Hudson House. Here's the Indiana limestone of the columns. And each shaft is a single block or monolith, not pieced, much more expensive because you had to pick blemish-free stone, and the heavy monolith was harder to handle than smaller blocks. Like sandstone, limestone tends to have a granular surface. Indiana limestone is classed as oolitic. Oolitic, from the Greek words for egg and stone. Egg and stone, because the stone resembles fish eggs or fish roe. One of the Commonwealth of Virginia's geologists once gave me a simple tip for recognizing limestone. This friend, the late Harry Webb, said that the sediment, you recognize the stone because the sediment includes shells and other remains of sea creatures. The fossils in an Indiana limestone bed can be large, like you know who's 3 inches long. We've used Cosmo today as a foreshadowing and a memory aid. In fact, we bought him last year, just pre-pandemic, for that very purpose, meaning to put him on display on a table in this room. Good builders avoided putting stone with large fossils in important locations. Less conspicuous parts of buildings are where the fossils may show up. On the quite conspicuous Hutton column on the screen, here's a tiny shell. It's fun to look for fossils in limestone walls. But simply, if stone is pale and fine textured with many small grains, It's usually Indiana limestone, as we see all over the place. Perhaps right on the New Wing of Cabell Library, though we haven't been able to confirm this. Indiana limestone is still very much in production. Here's 2 commercial samples that we got last year from that ill-fated display table. The Indiana Geological Survey sells various memorabilia, such as a limestone lover's gift pack, including quite a good video, a sample of the stone shaped like the stage, and, would you guess, a crinoid bookmark. We like our gift pack, but it doesn't include the Indiana limestone song from 1948 by one John McGee, The Girl from Oolitic. When I hang my clothes on a hickory limb, things will all be hunky-dory, because I'm on my way to swim and play in a good old quarry. We've quoted this in your source list. Fossils are a way that stonework lets us see into the far past. The fossils in Indiana limestone give us a minute glimpse into a time around 340 million years ago. The Indiana Geological Survey tells us that at the time, the state was a shallow tropical sea teeming with varied fauna that extracted calcium carbonate from the water for their shells and skeletons, especially crinoids. That's a remote part of the timeline that the stone lets us see. The stonework also lets us see a recent part of the timeline. Let's look at the carving at the front door. We can virtually see the hand of skilled ornamental carvers at work a century ago because we can read their tool marks. The 3 most basic tools in traditional stone carving for millennia have been the chisel, that's the tooth chisel, and the straight chisel, and others, the point or punch, and the drill. A Hudson carver used chisels up here. He drove a tooth chisel along this molding to make these crisp furrows. Then he drove a straight chisel along the ridges to reduce those ridges. A point driven by a hammer outlined this leaf and cut back the background. Whoops, I got ahead of myself. So the point shaped the silhouette of the leaf and cut back the background, and then a drill sank the hollows of the leaves. You plainly see the round drill hole. Abrasives finished the smooth areas. With a little patience, you can recognize the tool marks that identify the kind of handwork that you see. Thanks to John Ruskin, we can appreciate recognizing the action of a human hand. The pattern here, though, is in an Italian Renaissance vein provided from the architect's office, not invented by the stonecutter. Now, time for marble. As we said, unimaginable pressure over the ages turns limestone into marble. The pressure crushes those shells out of existence. Ouch, indeed. You will find no shells in the marble of the Hutton porch. But let's look at a different example. We go through the well-preserved Hutton hallway. The front parlor is lost, but the back parlor was virtually a twin and it's intact. It's now a seminar room. And here it is in a fine shot by Chris Novelli of the Department of Historic Resources. And here's the chimney piece made of several kinds of marble. Something of the luminosity of the best white marble comes through in this shot, and the only shell present is carved. And that's stone. So, the closing. We had thought that Cosmo would announce the closing. Louise, however, has discovered on the web that it is the day of the crinoids. One of them has made it to Pokemon. His name is Cradley, pronounced variously. When we return, it's time for comments. Present, it's time for a break. When we come back, comments and questions.
Welcome back, everyone. We're going to start this next portion of the event with questions about everything that we've talked about so far. If you have questions for Dr. Brownell, please either unmute and ask your question verbally, or you can also put your questions in the chat and we'll make sure those get asked too. And now, our speaker returns.
As a faculty member, I used to be expected to ask questions of guest speakers. I rarely could think of anything very intelligent to say. They were usually talking about things I didn't know about. A lot of us get to sit and squirm during a discussion period. You know, we could go ahead. We move from the discussion to the tips. Should we do that?
No.
Why don't we?
What about the discussion?
Well, we're waiting for somebody to ask a question or make a comment.
Okay, I'm ready.
Fire away.
Hello, this is Tom Ollinger. Can you hear my question?
Yes, we can.
Good. I was wondering if there's a relationship between the decorative carving on the brownstones and the arts and crafts movement in England, such as William Morris's work.
Oh, what a good question. Yes, that decorative carving does have a family resemblance to William Morris. It's a collateral descendant. Morris started off within the aesthetic movement. He's one of the creators of the aesthetic movement. And the aesthetic movement arose to rescue the world from its ugliness by, in particular, promoting beauty in the home. The aesthetic movement evolved into the arts and crafts movement when it got a social conscience. William Morris began, well, he took the side of labor, not very effectively perhaps, but that's the great change when the aesthetic movement became the arts and crafts movement. The aesthetic movement is, which happens to be, Louise is my favorite, it's what we mainly collect. It was self-centered, and the ornaments on a building such as the Anderson House don't betray any social conscience. as the arts and crafts movement took off in this country in the very late 1890s, at least professing to be concerned about well-being, the well-being of large groups of people, became built into the design reform. So that decorative carving that you ask about has, yeah, there's a genuine kinship with Morris. And in fact, now that I've had a moment to think, one of the greatest kinships there is the taste of the aesthetic movement into the arts and crafts movement for pattern and pattern and pattern. Sometimes in history, people have preferred big, smooth, plain surfaces. And at other times, they've preferred lots of ornament. And William Morris's textiles and wallpapers are the embodiment of lots of coherent pattern. And that frieze on the Anderson house is a kissing cousin.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Mr. Hollinger.
Hi, I have a question. Rick McNeil from just east of the city. I think you've been out here, Dr. Brownell.
Yes, Rick, I remember our visit.
That was a splendid visit, but for another time, another place. I have a quarry question, and that is all of this stone being brought in for the fronts of houses. Is there any relation to where these people are buried in Hollywood, the statuary there? It looks like there's a lot of limestone. And in fact, like, did the train car have equal statuary for equal stone for houses and for the cemetery? That's my quarry question. The use of quarries in cemetery, and is there the tie-in? Is there anything?
I don't know. What is striking is that in Hollywood, the cemetery I know best, the earlier expensive monuments are marble, which did not wear well in the weather very often. Not always, but all too often. And the great shift in the late 19th century was just that wonderful, defy the ages granite. And the granite, do you know, I've never looked around Hollywood. I'd be willing to bet almost anything that all the silver gray granite is local granite, quarried here and cut here. And of course, stonecutters' yards are still cutting granite for cemeteries. I'm having great difficulty coming up with any limestone monuments at all. Permanence, of course, was a central issue. And some stones let people down very badly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Brownell, this is Robin Jones, and I want to thank you for your presentation today. There's something about the method of your presentation that is so clear that it makes me feel like, well, I should have known that, or how come I didn't know that? So thank you for that. Let me ask my question and then hear you. I'm stunned by the intricate decorations that you are showing us on some of these buildings. Some of it is just up so high. Did the artisans really expect people to see and really appreciate their efforts?
That's always a good question. And Louise and I speak from the viewpoint of having been up too many ladders because we just couldn't see the details. the issue of designing in perspective is a big one, which architects and decorative artists conceived of their work intelligently, looking into its use, designing it for what people could see up close and what would be further off. In woodwork, one of the standard Victorian cornices all over Richmond, the Italianate cornice, which has very large brackets coming out through the frieze. That's a perspective cornice. That was meant to be understood from down below, and the detailing is very simple. That question really does cut with a sharp edge, because unthinkingly, I have always focused on the lower carved frieze on the Anderson House, and I have a far less clear idea what the upper frieze is, and it is observable that that house is distinctly ostentatious. Charles Reed was not that experienced an architect, and the subtlety of planning for what people would be able to see is quite likely to have eluded him at least somewhat. Do you know, that's a good question for everybody to take away in looking at a building. Are some parts at a distance well designed to be seen by people at ground level, or are they absolutely misconceived? As to intelligibility, retirement has given Louise and me an ecstatic opportunity. For decades, we went to other people's lectures and came away feeling stupid because we couldn't follow and we couldn't see the point. And in retirement, there's the time to go over and over those outlines and make the bone structure just as clear as a quartz crystal in a granite block. Thank you for the compliment.
Yes, I'm a former student from VCU, pre-VCU, 64 to 68. And I've lived and learned in and among all of these buildings. And it's fascinating to hear the information you've shared, because when I lived there, I didn't really care about it. I live in upstate central New York now, and there are a lot of buildings around here in the Utica area that are similar. And I can look at them looking back now. I'm wondering, since the college owns so much of this area now and has for years, is it their plan to maintain the older buildings now and not tear down more? I know many have been torn down over the years.
At least the age of tearing down the historic buildings passed. And it was Carrie Culhane, whom I mentioned, who she and I fought the intended demolition of two of the last mansions on the 900 block of Grace Street. She's a fighter. In fact, the Monroe Park campus is a registered historic district, so the buildings have that degree that is, they're on the district is on the U.S. National Historic Register. The buildings have survived more by benign neglect than anything else. Heartbreakingly, 15 years ago, the university architect, Mary Cox, who just retired a few months ago, came up with a brilliant idea of applying to the Getty Foundation for a Getty Campus Heritage Grant. Ray Bonus and I assisted her on the application, but it was really written by a specialist. And if the money had come through, protections would have been put in place for the buildings. There would have been a plan for their maintenance and revivification, a program of student guides to explain to people why they matter. And alas, the Getty Foundation, despite the fact that the buildings are plainly important, these are blocks where some of the most powerful people in Virginia history lived. Despite the importance of the buildings and the extent of the documentation, we didn't get the money. The buildings nonetheless hang on because the people who occupy them tend to love them and take care of them.
Well, it's good to know you're still working on it. I lived in 922 West Franklin and also the old Lee House when I first started there, which I know is gone. So, you know, excuse me?
What floor of 922?
Third.
That was my floor for the years I taught. My office was a former dormitory.
Yeah, okay. Well, in 68, actually it was in there in 66, 67, I guess, because we got moved there from Lee House after the first semester. So. But yes, I lived there and other places, you know, along Grove Avenue on the first block of the school. So I kind of keep up and look and see how things have changed. And I know a lot of buildings have gone, but it's also good to see some of the older houses maintained.
It is indeed. Okay, any more questions?
We do have a couple. One from John Beatty with the Cornerstone building on West Broad. He says, it looks as if the brownstone is the same as that of many of the mansions. Do you have any thoughts on that? And that is the Masonic Temple.
Oh. We haven't found out where most of the brownstone came from. In preparing for this lecture, I had one of my favorite notions shattered, that the reddish-orange brownstone of Ginter House, and I think it's the same brownstone on the former Masonic Temple on Broad. I thought that was Seneca sandstone from Maryland. Well, it just plain isn't. A newspaper account of the period alludes to the fact that most of Richmond's brownstone came from New Jersey or Surprise. New Jersey brownstone is well known. Came from New Jersey or North Carolina, and that was completely a new one on me. So that question is hanging, and we never found that much documentation on the actual creation of the old Masonic Temple, which is one of the most glorious freestyle buildings in Richmond. It is just a treat to look at.
Yes.
My name is Chuck Clark. I am also a former student, and when I ride up and down Franklin Street, I remember that my wife's OBGYN had an office in one of the buildings there. I wonder if any research has been done into which buildings were what before they became part of the campus.
There has indeed been some. I listed in the handout, for instance, a paper by Jessica Wietek. She is the one who discovered that 926 passed from being private house to multiple family to being doctor's offices. And it's she who pointed out that there was a hospital on the 900 block of Grace Street, St. Luke's Hospital. And indeed,
Yes.
West Franklin Street became something of a doctor's row.
Yep.
Building after building has had doctor's offices in them. Nobody's ever compiled which doctors where, but you obviously remember some cases. I remember some cases where the signage was still up in the early 90s. So that was part of the evolution from a chic residential area left behind as Monument Avenue opened up, making it possible to have freestanding houses, lighted and ventilated from both sides. The Franklin Street area began to decay. Even before the decay set in, apartment buildings began to appear on West Franklin on the 900 block. The Chesterfield was the first New York-style apartment building in Richmond, begun in 1901, for people who wanted to live near very well-to-do people, but weren't in a position to have servants. So the blocks went from chic residential to multiple family, and then came doctors and nurses, and the nurses came aplenty.
Thank
That's
you.
probably as far as I can take that question.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And I think we have maybe one more question. Kate, would you like to unmute and say hi, or would you like me to ask your question? I'm happy to do it.
No, I'll do it. Hello, Dr. Brownell. I was
Hi.
one of your students in your first or second year at VCU.
What was your
And I
name?
wrote- Kate Fitt, and I wrote a paper on the Richmond
Oh,
Female
Kate,
Institute.
yes.
And every time I go by the location, I think of you. But one thing I was wondering, since in my work, I discovered that the building had been pretty much completed in 7 months. And I wondered if subsequently any of your students has done work on builders here, and specifically the Gibson brothers who built the Richmond Female Institute.
Yes, I remember your attempt to study the Gibson brothers. The Gibson brothers were a hugely important contracting firm in the mid to late 19th century. And one of the Gibsons became emboldened to practice under the title of architect. And I regret to say that the subject of the Gibson family is still where you left it and I left it in the early 1990s. They are important, and we know they were important, and no one has put the documents together. So,
Yeah, that's too bad, but thank you anyway. And even though my area of main interest was the first half of the 20th century, I got a tremendous amount out of your class and have appreciated it very much.
thank you, Kate. People, the two most infrequent expressions in the English language, I think, are well done and thank you. You just used both of them. Thank you. Since we've hit a high note, why don't we move on to tips for exploring? A copy of McKee opens doors up. More accurately, it opens walls up. With or without the book, you can go probing, or perhaps just keep on the alert from day to day. When you go looking for one thing, you're likely to make discoveries about other things that you didn't have in mind at all. It's very pleasant. We'll first do tips on 2 members of the brick family, then 3 tips on stone. So first, brick on the Monroe Park campus. Of course, you can start your own rainbow spectrum of brick colors on this campus. and by no means only with old buildings. In the process, you can find an array of different brickwork patterns. Brick has sisters: terracotta, literally cooked earth, and more modest earthenware tiles. Terracotta is made of finer clay than brick. It can be molded into decorations from the cherubic to the diabolic, with a zoological garden of forms in between. Keep in mind that most of us tend not to look up, so we miss a great deal, and not just in architecture, but you do have to be quite careful on uneven pavement, of which there's a plenty in this vicinity. The other sister to brick is tiles of less fine clay than terracotta, but tiles are never to be sniffed at. Tiles can be flat and colored, or molded in relief and colored, and there's other possibilities. The brick, terracotta, and tile family is a family that gets along well together. Or in another phrase, this clay group provides an earthy garden of delights. Second is stone. 3 ideas. A, learning to enjoy stone surfaces. There's a pleasure in recognizing these materials. And that Hunton porch is our mini micro teeny-pedia of kinds of stone. Granite with its granular and faintly translucent surface, subtle limestone with its fossils, and marble with its faint luminosity. And in particular, I'll say it again, we've never captured the thousands of mica sparkles in any piece of that beautiful silvery Richmond granite. You can see those sparkles in the flesh, not just on mansions, but all over Richmond, in steps and curbstones and even alleyways. B, there's learning to spot tool marks, especially those of the tooth chisel, the point, and the drill. On sculpture, as well as ornamental carving, a trip to the Virginia Museum, for instance, repays some drill mark snooping. Finding drill holes is fun. A related amusement has exercised our wits for 40 years, recognizing terracotta that simulates cut stone. For instance, there's the Scott House at VCU. Originally, the Scotts meant to have the house sheathed extravagantly in pink marble from Tennessee, as we learned from the architect's specifications of 1908. And we owe our copy of the specs to Chris Novelli. The specifications record the change to a more economical choice, the lovely buff Indiana limestone. And again, backing off from extravagance, the specifications note that the exterior details were not to be carved, but were to follow a more economical alternative widely used at the time. These details are fine terracotta, made in multiples in molds, and beautifully glazed to match the stone. We've gone over to the east side, and we look where the arrow is at the Indiana limestone walls, which have those crisp channels left by the tooth chisel. The adjacent moldings have channels too, but that channeling is just a little soft looking because it was made by dragging a kind of comb across the soft surface of the terracotta. There are no fossils in those moldings. This isn't the only building on the street with terracotta that simulates stone, and you're set now to pick that out just about any time. The giveaway is the slightly gloopy look of the imitation tooth chisel works. Third, there's hunting those Ruskinian, no two alike details. And here one needs to go beyond the campus. There are quite a few Hummelstown brownstone buildings in Richmond, probably by Gilbert Hunt and William Mason. You can recognize most of them by the presence of those odd stacked pillars and varied capitals. Some of these other buildings have more engaging detail than our Franklin Street example. Can you find that? And examples of the principle of no two alike aren't just a matter of Hummelstown stone and pillar capitals. But there, you're probably ready to start looking for yourself, which is the best way. With a few tips, you can start making your own discoveries, raising your own questions that may possibly lead to a little reading. Richmond is great for hunting architectural details. If you include obvious areas such as the Fan and Church Hill, and less obvious ones. Even my commonplace 1970s colonial revival subdivision repays looking around. Now, once again, we had meant to put Cosmo on to say the closing lines, but in the day of the crinoid, Louise has found that you can get Cradley the crinoid as a foot-long plush crinoid doll, $16 on eBay. Thank you for attending. Have fun till next year.